Um, so picture a young boy, right? Kneeling in the dead of winter, surrounded by just freezing snow.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a harsh image.
Yeah, it really is. And his muscles are completely locked, his breathing is super shallow, and he is enduring this agonizing physical beating from a man he literally calls his master.
Ooh, right.
But here's the thing. He has every physical ability to defend himself. I mean, he's trained for it. He could strike back or, he could at the very least just run away into the woods.
But he doesn't do any of that, does he?
No, he doesn't move a single muscle. He absorbs every blow in total silence. And, well, why? Because he has been systematically convinced that to endure this abuse without question is his highest moral duty. Like, the beating isn't just a punishment to you. In his mind, it's holy.
Man, it's such a deeply uncomfortable image. And it really gets to the very core of what we're looking at today. Like, what does it actually take to dismantle someone's sense of self so thoroughly that they view their own subjugation as a virtue?
Exactly. And welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking the mechanics of human obedience. Not just why you or I might follow a speed limit, but how massive systemic architectures of control actually function.
Right, why human beings willingly surrender their agency to authority even when that surrender turns destructive.
Yeah, and to do this, we're using a really fascinating stack of material. We've got a comprehensive psychological and historical dossier called Empire Psychology, Why People Obey, which, gives us the hard science.
But to give that science a pulse, we're looking at it through the lens of a sci-fi fantasy novel, San Vitae, The Awakening, which is where that boy in the snow comes from.
Right.
His name's Tyrion. He's a character from the novel who lives under the oppressive rule of the fictional Santeri Empire. And by mapping the real-world psychology of systemic control onto Tyrion's deeply visceral fictional experience, we can actually see how these abstract concepts of power function on a human level.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we want to understand how an authority figure can just override human instinct, we usually default to those classic 1960s psychology studies, right?
Oh, for sure, the classics.
The ones. The Milgram experiment, where participants thought they were delivering lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a lab coat told them to. Or the Stanford prison experiment, where college kids assigned as guards became completely abusive practically overnight.
Right. Those are always the go-to examples.
But I actually want to push back a little on using those as our baseline, especially Zimbardo's prison experiment. Because, in recent years, that study has faced massive criticism.
Oh, absolutely it has.
Yeah. There are records showing the researchers actively coached the quote-unquote guards on how to be cruel. It wasn't just this spontaneous emergence of human evil. It's like when you blindly follow your GPS, even when it tells you to drive into a lake,
Right.
The uniform, or the screen in the GPS case, acts as a permission slip to completely bypass your own moral compass. I don't think they were just inherently bad kids.
No, you're absolutely right to challenge that. The popular narrative around Stanford prison, that we are all just, secretly sadistic if you hand us the badge, is heavily flawed.
Exactly.
But what's fascinating here is the irony of it all. The researcher manipulation you just mentioned actually proves the deeper point our psychological research is making today.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, the guards were cruel because the ultimate authority figure in the room, the lead scientist, implicitly demanded it. What both Milgram and the real history of the Stanford experiment reveal isn't inherent malice. It's the sheer power of the diffusion of responsibility.
Oh, diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah.
Hey, let's break that down for everyone. How exactly does that diffusion work in the brain?
So think about the cognitive load of moral decision-making. Navigating what is right and wrong in a really chaotic world takes a massive amount of mental energy.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
Exactly. It causes stress, it causes anxiety.
Yeah.
When an authority figure steps in, whether that's a scientist with a clipboard or a military general or a religious leader, and they say, I have the answers, I am taking responsibility for the outcome, your brain actually experiences a physiological rush of relief.
Wow. A literal rush of relief.
Yes, because the burden of consequences passed up the chain of command, you no longer have to perform that exhausting moral calculus.
Man, it's the ultimate cognitive offloading. That's why I always think of it like following the GPS.
Yeah.
You see the water, your eyes are telling you there's a literal lake right in front of you, but the machine possesses this aura of absolute infallible authority.
Right, the screen tells you to turn.
Yeah, and the screen just acts as a psychological permission slip to completely bypass your own sensory inputs and your internal navigation.
That's a brilliant way to frame it, actually. The authority figure serves as that GPS, and once you hand over the wheel, The human brain is highly adaptable to whatever environment it finds itself in.
So it just adjusts to the new normal.
Exactly. If the environment rewards compliance and punishes questioning, the brain rapidly rewires its reward centers to prioritize obedience above all else.
Okay, so if a simple lab coat or a dashboard screen can make us abandon our own judgment in an afternoon, what happens when that authority figure isn't just a scientist, but a massive, multi-generational institution?
Now we're talking about the architecture of empire.
Right, and this is where the fictional Santori from San Vitae becomes such a perfect case study. If you read the lore of the book, the Santori don't maintain their empire just by having the biggest army, right?
No, they don't.
They use a foundational legal framework called the Deidrith Accord.
Yes, and looking at the mechanics of the Deidrith Accord really helps us understand how real-world empires scale obedience. Because a single authoritarian leader, they can't be everywhere at once.
Right, they need a system.
Precisely. You have to build a psychological cage that the citizens willingly walk into. And the psychological research points out that historically, you see this scaled through three distinct mechanisms: predictable fear, pervasive propaganda, and physical ritual.
Let's focus on the fear aspect for a second, because the dossier makes a really important distinction here. It's not just about random violence, is it? It's about predictable violence.
Yes, absolutely crucial distinction. Random violence creates chaos. And
Well,
chaos breeds rebellion because people feel like, well, they have nothing left to lose anyway.
right, if I'm going to get hurt no matter what I do, I might as well fight back.
Exactly. But predictable fear, knowing exactly what lines you cannot cross, that creates a perverse sense of safety. If I just keep my head down, if I just pay my taxes or offer my grain, I will survive.
The empire establishes the rules of survival, and then the citizen just enforces those rules upon themselves.
That's it. It's self-policing.
Which moves us right into the propaganda and the rituals. And I find the physical rituals so fascinating. Like in San Vitae, there are strict covenants about how to address a covenness, how to stand, when to be silent.
Yes, very specific physical requirements.
And historically, the dossier mentions the subjects of the Qin dynasty, right? Bowing so low their foreheads literally touch the earth. But how does the physical act of bowing actually enforce mental obedience? Like, what's happening there?
Well, it comes down to a neurological process related to cognitive dissonance and proprioceptive feedback.
Okay, those are some big words.
Right, let me break it down. Your brain is constantly monitoring what your physical body is doing to inform how it should feel. So if you force a population to physically kneel, to avert their eyes, or say to chant in unison at a rally, the brain experiences a disconnect.
A disconnect between what they feel and what they're doing.
Exactly. The brain thinks I am physically acting subordinate right now. The only logical reason I would do this is if I genuinely believe I am inferior to this ruler. Right, because the brain hates cognitive dissonance. So to resolve that discomfort, the brain literally alters its own internal beliefs to match the body's actions. The physical ritual writes the psychological reality.
So if I'm chanting at a rally, my brain is actively aligning my internal beliefs with the sound of my own voice.
You've got it.
That is wild. It really shifts the perspective on human conformity. We aren't just mindless followers blindly stumbling behind a leader. Obedience is actually an incredibly complex evolutionary survival strategy. So is obedience just a fundamental human weakness?
No, the research is very clear on this. We have to strip away the judgment for a moment and just look at the evolutionary math. For hundreds of thousands of years, to be cast out of the hunter-gatherer tribe meant certain death.
Right. By starvation or predators.
Belonging was synonymous with breathing. When you are faced with an overwhelming power structure, conformity is not an act of cowardice. It is a highly rational, calculated decision. For the individual, belonging feels significantly safer than rebellion.
You do the math, right? Rebellion equals death, submission equals life.
Exactly. Over time, obedience stops being a conscious decision and just becomes an ingrained habit. But here is the tragedy of human history. We are meaning-making creatures. We can't just tell ourselves, I'm submitting because I am terrified.
Because that destroys the ego.
Right. We need a narrative that makes our submission noble. We need to believe we are obeying because it is the right thing to do.
And man, have we spent a lot of centuries crafting that narrative. I mean, we've spent thousands of years trying to intellectually and spiritually justify the yoke.
We really have.
The historical analysis in our sources outlines this massive philosophical debate over obedience. You've got someone like Thomas Hobbes, who famously argued that without strict obedience to an absolute sovereign, human life would just be nasty, brutish, and short.
And we have to remember the context for Hobbes, though. He wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower dreaming up these pessimistic theories. He lived through the English Civil War.
Oh, right.
He literally watched neighbors slaughter neighbors in the streets. His philosophy was born of profound trauma. To Hobbes, the chaos of human freedom was so terrifying that surrendering to an all-powerful Leviathan, a sovereign ruler, was the only way to guarantee a peaceful night's sleep.
So for him, order was absolutely worth the price of submission, and he's not alone in that. I mean,
Yeah.
the dossier mentions Plato, arguing that a just society requires a rigid hierarchy where everyone just knows their place.
Right.
You see Confucius framing obedience as a moral duty,
Right.
a requirement for cosmic balance. The subject obeys the ruler to maintain harmony in the universe itself.
It's all about order.
But then you hit the Enlightenment and the existentialist thinkers, and
Yeah.
they completely flip the script. They argue that when you unquestioningly surrender your agency, you aren't achieving harmony at all. You are erasing your own selfhood.
Yes.
They say you stop being a human being and you just become an instrument. And we're just reporting what the dossier says here, not taking sides, but it's a huge shift in thought.
It is, and it's a terrifying realization for any ruling class. Because if philosophy can be debated, it isn't strong enough to secure absolute loyalty.
Someone can always argue against it.
Exactly. To make the hierarchy unbreakable, an empire has to make it sacred. When we look at the mechanics of control, layering theology over power structures is the ultimate trump card. Religion is often used to sanctify that hierarchy.
Weaponized holiness.
That's a great way to put it. Think of the concept of the divine right of kings in European history. If the monarch is placed on the throne by God, then a political grievance isn't just treason, is it?
No, it's a sin.
It is a damnable sin against the creator of the universe. Or look at extreme interpretations of monastic rules across various traditions, where the total surrender of the individual will to the spiritual elder is framed as the only path to enlightenment. Holiness is weaponized to silence dissent.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because that brings us right back to that freezing snow and Curien in San Vitae. This is where the synthesis of the real-world psychology and the fiction really hits hard.
It really does.
Because Curien isn't just a conscripted soldier for the Santori. He is bonded to a leader, Covenus Masucci, through what is essentially a sacred contract. When his trainer, Master Gosseth, is beating him, it isn't just physical conditioning. The text literally says, quote, "The lesson as the conscript of a Covenus is to know when to be silent."
That line perfectly distills the theology of submission.
It does.
Curien is taught that his individual pain is irrelevant. His internal desires are just a distraction. His highest spiritual purpose in this universe is to be an empty vessel for the empire's will. His identity is totally consumed by his utility.
And the awful paradox here, and this is something that psychological analysis really wrestles with, is that this exact mechanism of unquestioning obedience is responsible for both our greatest achievements and our most horrific atrocities.
Yeah, the duality of it is striking.
Because, I mean, you can't build the Roman aqueducts or coordinate a massive lunar landing without an enormous amount of collective submission to a shared goal.
Right, you need coordination.
But it also takes organized, highly obedient people to subjugate an entire underclass or operate a systemic prison camp. The existentialists were right on this front. The greatest crimes aren't committed by rule breakers. They are committed by people meticulously following the rules.
It's a sobering reality, which, naturally forces us to ask, if obedience is this deeply ingrained, evolutionarily necessary, philosophically defended, and religiously sanctified habit, how does anyone ever break out of it?
Right. What is the catalyst for rebellion? Because the subtitle of the novel is literally The Awakening. We know Curien eventually snaps. But what causes the psychological prison to finally crack?
Well, the crack begins when the cognitive dissonance we talked about earlier becomes just too loud to ignore. Our psychological research refers to this as the fracturing of the protector archetype.
The protector archetype.
Yeah. In Curien's case, he has built his entire sense of self around this noble idea of protecting his covenants and serving the system. But what happens when the system he is sworn to protect demands actions that fundamentally violate his deepest core empathy?
Oh, man. It's the moment the GPS tells you to drive into the lake. But this time, there are literally people drowning in the water, and you realize you have to hit the brakes.
Yes. Perfect analogy. The human mind can only endure the suppression of its own agency for so long before it experiences a psychological breaking point. For a long time, Curien rationalized the cruelty of the Santori as a necessary evil for order. But oppressive systems, by their very nature, eventually suffer from terminal moral decay.
Because they outlive consequence.
Exactly.
If a ruling council like the Sandri demands absolute obedience for generations and never faces any pushback, the feedback loop completely severs. They lose all empathy. They don't have to care about the people they govern because the people just automatically obey. The machine runs purely on the inertia of submission.
And that arrogance is always the empire's downfall. They rely so heavily on the habit of obedience that they inevitably push the cruelty too far. At a certain point, the survival math we talked about flips.
The cost becomes too high.
Right. The psychological and physical cost of continuing to submit becomes higher than the terror of the punishment. Survival is no longer enough if you are surviving as an empty, hollowed-out shell.
So what does this all mean?
Well, it brings us to the most powerful thesis in all of this research. It's the realization that empires, whether it's the magical century council or historical authoritarian regimes, are actually incredibly fragile.
Fragile. Even with all that power.
Yes. They build these massive monuments, they project this aura of absolute godlike invincibility, but it's all a psychological illusion. They don't endure because they are inherently strong. They endure simply because people obey.
Wow.
Obedience is the quiet, invisible engine of all systemic power. The propaganda, the fear, the complex rituals of the Didraith Accord, none of it has any actual weight unless the populace agrees to participate.
Right.
Power is never inherently held by the ruler. It is continuously granted by the ruled. And the moment a critical mass of individuals decides to stop granting it, to stop participating in the ritual, the engine stalls.
The moment you just step back from that metal console, look at the man in the white lab coat and say, no, I don't care what the experiment requires. I'm done.
Precisely. It is the terrifying yet liberating realization of individual agency.
Now, I know you might be listening to this on your commute or while making dinner thinking, okay, this is a great breakdown of history and sci-fi lore, but I'm not a conscript in a magical empire and I'm not bowing to an emperor. But you navigate invisible architectures of obedience every single day.
We all do, literally every day.
You navigate them in corporate structures that use HR policies to enforce silence around toxic behavior. You navigate them in the algorithmically driven social circles that demand you conform to a specific ideology or risk being socially exiled.
Oh, absolutely.
You navigate them in the deep, unwritten cultural contracts that tell you exactly what milestones your life is supposed to hit by age 30 or 40. The lab coats and the emperors are still there. They've just been replaced by boardrooms, social metrics, and societal expectations.
Which leaves us with a critical question to consider. One that builds on everything we've explored today, from the psychology of survival to Korean's awakening.
What's the question?
If obedience is ultimately a strategy to reduce uncertainty, to blend in, to protect yourself from the chaos of standing out, at what point does surviving cost you the very identity you are trying to keep alive?
Man, think about that. Tomorrow morning, if you woke up and simply stopped performing the rituals of your daily obedience, if you stopped yielding to the invisible authorities that dictate your choices, who would you actually be beneath it all?
It's a heavy thought.
When the world tells you that the experiment requires you to continue, what happens when you finally say no? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you.